I thought I knew justice, delivering it calmly from my bench for 15 years. Then, an officer's fist shattered my jaw and taught me that sometimes justice needs to hit back. The gavel in my hand feels heavier on some days than on others. On that particular Tuesday, it felt like it was carved from lead. The air in my courtroom, courtroom 4B, was thick with a tension you could almost taste, metallic and sour like old blood. I'm Judge Marcus Thorne, and for 15 years I've presided over the chaos of human fallibility from the elevated sanctity of my bench. I've seen killers weep and saints lie. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. The case was People v. Chen, but it was really about Officer Frank Miller. David Chen, a 22-year-old art student, was on trial for assaulting an officer and resisting arrest. Officer Miller, a 15-year veteran with a neck as thick as a fire hydrant and a smirk that never quite left his face, was the prosecution's star witness. He sat in the witness box, his crisp blue uniform practically crackling with self-importance, a stark contrast to the slender, terrified young man at the defendant's table. From the moment Miller took the stand, he oozed a venomous sort of contempt. It wasn't just for the defendant. It was for the defense attorney, Ms. Evans, a sharp and relentless public defender. It was for the process itself. And I could feel it radiating towards me too, a subtle, dismissive sneer every time his eyes met mine. He saw a black man in a robe, not a judge. I'd encountered that look 1,000 times in my life, but it never failed to ignite a cold, controlled fire in my gut. My job, however, was to be impartial, to weigh the evidence, not the arrogance of the man presenting it. Miller's testimony was a textbook narrative. He claimed he saw Mr. Chen acting suspiciously in a neighborhood he didn't belong in. He initiated a stop, and Mr. Chen became, in his words, immediately belligerent and aggressive. He painted a picture of a violent young thug who lunged at him, forcing him to use necessary force to subdue the threat. His story was neat, tidy, and utterly damning. If you only had his words, David Chen was already guilty. But we didn't just have his words. We had his body cam. Ms. Evans was methodical. She let Miller build his fortress of lies, brick by confident brick. Then she calmly approached the clerk and said, "The defense would like to play the body camera footage from Officer Miller's uniform, designated People's Exhibit 4A. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Miller's smirk tightened. He crossed his arms, leaning back as if he were settling in to watch an entertaining movie. The large screen behind the witness stand flickered to life. The footage was jarringly different from the story he'd just told under oath. It showed David Chen walking down the sidewalk holding a portfolio case. Miller's police cruiser swerved to the curb, and he got out, already radiating hostility. "Hey, you! Where do you think you're going?" His voice boomed from the screen's speakers. David Chen stopped, looking confused. I'm just heading home, sir. I live 2 blocks from here." "Let me see some ID," Miller barked. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Chen's voice was polite, if a little shaky. The Miller on the screen scoffed. "You can ask whatever you want after you show me your ID, boy." The word boy hung in the air of my silent courtroom. It was a loaded grenade, and I saw a flicker of something anger, maybe fear, in David Chen's eyes at the defense table. On the witness stand, the real-life Miller's face was becoming a mask of stone. The footage continued. Chen produced his wallet. As he did, his art portfolio slipped, and he fumbled to catch it. That's when Miller escalated. "Don't you move. Hands where I can see them," he roared. Chen, startled, put his hands up, the portfolio clattering to the ground. The video clearly showed both of his hands, open and empty, raised to shoulder height. Miss Evans paused the video. The image of David Chen with his hands in the air, a look of pure terror on his face, was frozen on the screen. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you testified, under oath, that Mr. Chen lunged at you at this point. Do you see a lunge in this video?" Miller's jaw worked. "The video doesn't show everything. His posture was aggressive." "His posture," she repeated, incredulous. "His hands are in the air. Could you please point to the part of his posture that you interpreted as a prelude to an attack?" "Objection," the prosecutor mumbled. sounding defeated. "Overruled," I said, my voice like gravel. "The witness will answer the question." Miller glared, not at Miss Evans, but directly at me. The disdain was gone, replaced by pure, uncut rage. "You wouldn't understand," he spat. "You don't know what it's like out there." "What I know, officer," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register, "is that you are in a court of law, under oath. And this court finds your testimony to be in direct contradiction with the evidence. This court finds it hard to believe you feared for your safety when dealing with an unarmed student with his hands in the air." Every word was a hammer blow. I could see him physically recoiling. His authority, his entire worldview, was being dismantled in front of a gallery of strangers by a man he refused to see as his superior. The prosecutor was burying his face in his hands. David Chen was crying silently. Miss Evans went for the final blow. "Let's play the rest of the clip, shall we?" She hit play. The frozen image moved, and we all heard it. We heard Officer Miller, his voice a guttural snarl, shove David Chen against the brick wall. We heard the sickening thud. And then we heard the words that were not in the official transcript, a string of racial slurs so vile it made the air curdle. A collective gasp went through the gallery. I banged the gavel once, hard. "That's enough." I looked at Officer Miller. The mask was completely gone. His face was a blotchy, furious red. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the witness box. "Officer Miller," I said, my voice ringing with an authority he could no longer deny. "Given the incontrovertible evidence of perjury and aggravated assault by you, this court is dismissing all charges against Mr. Chen with prejudice." That was it. That was the moment the dam broke. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He moved. With a guttural roar, he vaulted over the side of the witness box. The two bailiffs positioned by the doors were caught flat-footed, their brains not yet processing the impossible. He took 3 long, pounding strides across the well of the court, a blur of blue and fury. I didn't even have time to stand. All I saw were his eyes burning with a hatred so profound it seemed to suck all the air from the room. And then he lunged, not at the defendant, not at the lawyer, but up at me on the bench. His arms swung, a piston of raw violence. The crack of bone against bone echoed in the sudden dead silence of my courtroom. Pain. It was a white-hot, blinding flash behind my eyes. The world tilted on its axis, and the dignified wood paneling of my courtroom became a nauseating, spinning blur. I felt the jarring impact travel down my spine, and the taste of copper filled my mouth. For a split second, there was only the ringing in my ears and the sight of Frank Miller's face, contorted with a primal satisfaction, inches from my own. He had done the unthinkable. He had assaulted a sitting judge, on the bench, in a full courtroom. The silence that had fallen was shattered. A woman in the gallery screamed. My 2 bailiffs, Officers Davis and Chen No, relation to the defendant, a cruel irony, were finally in motion. They were on Miller like wolves, a tangle of blue uniforms and desperate, grunting force. Davis, a burly former Marine, wrapped his arms around Miller's thick chest, trying to haul him back. Chen went for his legs, but Miller was fueled by a kind of berserker rage I'd only ever read about. He thrashed and bucked, a wild animal caught in a trap, still trying to get at me. "You think you're better than me?" he roared, his voice muffled as Davis wrenched his head back. "You piece of—" I put a hand to my cheek. It came away slick and crimson. My jaw screamed in protest, a deep, throbbing ache that was quickly escalating. My vision was starting to clear, swimming back into focus. Below me the struggle was chaotic. A chair scraped across the floor. Miss Evans had thrown herself in front of her client, David Chen, shielding him with her own body. The prosecutor stood frozen, his mouth agape, looking utterly useless. A cold clarity cut through the pain. This was my courtroom. He had violated my courtroom. He had violated the sanctity of the law itself. The pain was secondary. The rage was not. But it was a judge's rage, precise, controlled, and utterly unforgiving. "Officers!" My voice was a shredded rasp, but it cut through the din like a blade. "Get him on the floor. Now!" Davis and Chen used my command as a fulcrum. With a final, coordinated effort, they swept Miller's legs out from under him. He went down hard, his head hitting the wooden floor with a sickening crack that I felt a grim satisfaction in hearing. Davis was on his back immediately, a knee pinning Miller's neck to the ground, while Chen struggled to get his wrists into cuffs behind his back. The fight seemed to drain out of Miller then, replaced by a string of vile, racist curses directed at me. Each word was a shovelful of dirt on his own grave. "Court reporter, are you getting all of this?" I asked, my voice gaining strength. A shaken, pale young woman nodded from her station. "Yes, Your Honor. Every word." "Good," I said. I pushed myself up straighter in my chair, ignoring the spinning in my head and the fire in my jaw. I was bleeding on my robes. I didn't care. I looked down from my bench at the pathetic, swearing man being held down by my officers. The uniform he wore was a disgrace. The badge he carried was a stain. "Bring him to his feet," I commanded. "Bring the defendant before me." The bailiffs hauled a cuffed and disheveled Frank Miller up. They dragged him to the center of the well, right in front of my bench. His smirk was gone, replaced by a sweaty, desperate fury. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, and I met his gaze. The hatred was still there, but now it was joined by something else, the dawning, terrifying realization of what he had just done. He hadn't just hit a man, he had assaulted the entire judicial system, and I was its face. "Frank Miller," I began, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "You have committed perjury under oath. You have, by your own recorded words and actions, violated the civil rights of Mr. David Chen, and you have just now, in full view of this court, committed a felonious assault upon a judicial officer." I let the words hang there, each one a nail in his coffin. "The law you swore to uphold is not a suggestion," I continued, my voice low and dangerous. "The authority of this court is not a negotiation. Your badge does not place you above the law. It is supposed to bind you to it more tightly than any other citizen. You have failed. You have failed your badge, you have failed this city, and you have failed every concept of justice this building represents." I leaned forward, the pain in my face a sharp reminder of the task at hand. "For your outrageous, contemptible, and violent actions in this courtroom, I hereby find you in direct criminal contempt of court. Multiple counts. And I am sentencing you to the maximum allowable term for each count, to be served consecutively." The prosecutor finally found his voice, stepping forward weakly. "Your Honor, perhaps we should recess and have the DA's office file formal charges." "The DA's office will have its chance, Counselor." I cut him off, my eyes never leaving Miller's. "But the contempt of this court is mine to address, and I am addressing it. However, you are right about one thing. This is about more than just contempt." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Miller stared up at me, a caged animal waiting for the blow. He thought he knew what was coming. A long, drawn-out process, bail hearings, indictments, trials, years of legal maneuvering. He was wrong. He had brought the violence of the street into the sanctuary of the law, and I was about to show him that the law could be just as swift and far more absolute. "We will not be waiting for the district attorney's office to file new charges," I announced, my voice echoing in the chamber. "The crimes were committed here, the evidence is incontrovertible, and the judge is present." I looked down at the bleeding, cuffed officer and delivered the sentence that would shatter his world. "Mr. Miller, your sentencing hearing for felony assault and perjury begins right now." A tremor of shock went through the courtroom. It wasn't just a murmur, it was an audible, collective gasp. The prosecutor's face went white. Ms. Evans, who had just helped a trembling David Chen back to his seat, stared up at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. Even my bailiffs, Davis and Chen, exchanged a stunned glance over the top of Miller's head. An immediate sentencing hearing for new felonies committed moments ago. It was unorthodox. It was unprecedented. And it was exactly what this moment called for. "Your Honor, with all due respect," the prosecutor, a man named Harris, stammered, finally finding his footing. That's not how this works. He has a right to counsel, a right to a jury trial. He has a right to be tried by a jury of his peers for his crimes against Mr. Chen, Counselor Harris, had he not perjured himself so blatantly," I retorted, my voice like ice. "However, The crimes of assaulting a judicial officer during the commission of his duties and committing perjury in this very room fall under a different purview. He waived his right to a lengthy process when he vaulted that witness box. He committed his felonies in front of dozens of witnesses on the official court record against the very embodiment of the process you seek to defend. The evidence is the testimony of every person in this room. The proof is the blood on my face. I gestured to my jaw, which was now a symphony of agony. I could feel it swelling, a painful, puffy mound. Frank Miller, you are an officer of the law. You know the protocols. You know the consequences. Did you, or did you not, just strike me while I was presiding over this court? Miller, held firmly between the two bailiffs, just glared, his teeth clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He said nothing. Let the record show the defendant offers no denial, I said, my voice booming. Did you, or did you not, give testimony under oath that was directly and irrefutably contradicted by video evidence presented to this court? Silence again, just the ragged sound of his breathing. The record will reflect no denial, I repeated. Mr. Miller, you have committed an act of war against this institution. You have treated my courtroom like a back alley. So for this proceeding, we will dispense with the usual pleasantries. I turned my attention to the stunned defense attorney. Miss Evans, I imagine you are not prepared to represent Mr. Miller in this matter. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. No, Your Honor, I believe that would be a significant conflict of interest. I agree, I said. I scanned the gallery, my eyes landing on a man in a rumpled suit sitting in the back row, who I recognized as a seasoned public defender, often lingering to watch other cases. Mr. Davies, are you present? The man shot up straight. Yes, Your Honor. You are hereby appointed as counsel for Mr. Miller for the purpose of this sentencing hearing. Approach the bench. Davies looked like he'd been struck by lightning, but years of courtroom discipline took over. He walked forward on shaky legs, grabbing his briefcase. He conferred with the seething Frank Miller for no more than 30 seconds. I could see him pleading, advising. Miller just shook his head, spitting words I couldn't hear. Davies finally turned back to me, his face pale and resigned. Your Honor, my client refuses to participate. He does not recognize the court's authority to proceed in this manner. A dark, humorless smile touched my lips, though it sent a fresh spike of pain through my jaw. His recognition is not required. His presence is. We will proceed. This was it. The point of no return. I wasn't just a judge anymore. I was the guardian at the gate. Miller's attack wasn't personal. It was an attack on the idea that a black man could hold power over him, an attack on the system that dared to hold him accountable, and the system had to respond with overwhelming force. For the crime of perjury, a Class D felony, which you committed with flagrant and egregious disregard for the truth and the integrity of this court, I began, my voice a solemn tolling bell. I sentence you to the maximum allowable term, 7 years in state prison. Miller flinched. The first crack in his armor. 7 years was real time. For the crime of felony assault on a judicial officer, I continued, my gaze boring into him, a crime that strikes at the very heart of our legal system and constitutes an act of insurrection against the rule of law. I sentence you to the maximum allowable term, 15 years in state prison. A low groan escaped Miller's lips. The bailiffs tightened their grip as his knees seemed to buckle. 22 years. His life as he knew it was over. But I wasn't finished. Furthermore, for the multiple counts of direct criminal contempt, for your violent outburst, for your racist invective, for your utter refusal to respect the authority of this court, I am adding an additional 4 years. These sentences are to be served consecutively, not concurrently. Consecutively. 26 years. The number fell into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. 26 years. It was a lifetime. Miller stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief turning to horror. The rage was gone, extinguished by the cold, hard math of his future. He had thrown a punch, and the system, in my form, had thrown back a mountain. Bailiffs, I said, my voice cracking with the strain and the pain. Remand the prisoner into custody. Get him out of my sight. Davis and Chen started to haul him away. He was like a dead weight, his feet dragging, his head hung low. The fight was over. Justice, swift and brutal, had been served. I leaned back in my chair, the adrenaline starting to fade, leaving only a vast, throbbing exhaustion in its wake. The courtroom was silent, the spectators seemingly afraid to breathe. It was done. But as the bailiffs dragged the broken man towards the courtroom doors, Miller seemed to find one last ember of defiance. He lifted his head, his eyes locking with mine one final time. The hatred was back, but it was different now. It was colder, sharper, honed by the promise of a long, bitter incarceration. He opened his mouth, and it wasn't a roar this time. It was a hoarse, venomous whisper that carried across the silent room, a final poisoned dart aimed directly at me. "This isn't over, Thorne," he rasped, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "You took my life. Just wait until you see what my brothers do to yours." The words hung in the air long after the heavy courtroom doors boomed shut behind him. My brothers. It wasn't a desperate threat. It was a promise. A chill, colder than the pain in my jaw, snaked its way down my spine. He wasn't talking about his family. He was talking about his tribe. The blue wall of silence, a fraternity bound by badges and a shared, often twisted, sense of loyalty. For the first time since he'd vaulted the witness box, I felt a flicker of fear. The next few hours were a blur of medics, police brass, and concerned colleagues. My jaw was fractured in 2 places. As an EMT gently cleaned the cut on my cheek in my chambers, the chief of police himself, a man I'd clashed with on policy more than once, stood grim-faced in the doorway. "Judge Thorne, Marcus, I'm appalled," he said, his voice heavy. "What Miller did was an unforgivable stain on this department. He's been fired, obviously, and his union has already dropped him. No one is defending this." "I appreciate that, Chief," I said, my words slurred from the swelling. But his last words to me were a threat. He mentioned his brothers. The chief's expression hardened. "I heard. We're taking it very seriously. There will be an internal investigation into his unit, his partners, anyone who might share his proclivities. And I'm assigning a 24/7 protective detail to you and your family, effective immediately." For the next 2 weeks my life was turned upside down. My house, a place of peace and refuge, became a command post. 2 plainclothes officers were always there, parked at the curb, sitting in my living room. My wife, Sarah, was a rock, but I could see the terror in her eyes every time the phone rang. My daughter, Chloe, had to be driven to and from her college classes by an armed guard. Miller's threat had succeeded in one way. He had brought the ugliness of his world crashing into mine. The media frenzy was relentless. Hero Judge and courtroom chaos were plastered across every news channel. I became an unwilling symbol. To some, I was a hero who stood up to a corrupt system. To others, lurking in the dark corners of the internet, I was the villain who had destroyed a decorated officer. The threats came in, anonymous and ugly, filled with the same racist bile Miller had spewed. But something else was happening too. Something I hadn't expected. The case of People vs. Chen was over, but the case of Frank Miller had just begun. The district attorney, spurred by the public outcry and the undeniable evidence, didn't just accept my courtroom sentencing. He convened a grand jury. He saw Miller's assault on me not as a singular event, but as the tipping point of a long, rotten career. My court reporter's transcript and the body cam footage became the cornerstone of a massive investigation. David Chen, no longer a defendant but a key witness, testified bravely about his ordeal. And then the cracks in the blue wall began to appear. An anonymous tip line was set up, and calls started coming in. Other victims of Miller's aggressive policing, people whose complaints had been dismissed for years, came forward with their stories. Young officers, tired of being tainted by the likes of Miller, began speaking to Internal Affairs, detailing his long history of racism, his violent temper, his habit of losing exculpatory evidence. It turned out Frank Miller's brothers weren't as loyal as he thought. Faced with the choice between protecting a disgraced violent criminal and saving their own careers, most chose themselves. 3 of his closest partners were suspended pending investigation. His supervising sergeant was demoted for years of turning a blind eye. The entire precinct was placed under a consent decree, a federal oversight I had been advocating for years. Miller hadn't just destroyed his own life, he had brought his whole corrupt house of cards crashing down with him. 3 months later my jaw had mostly healed, though it still ached when the weather turned cold. I was back on the bench, the gavel feeling a little lighter in my hand. Frank Miller, already serving my 26-year sentence, was brought before a different judge to face a mountain of new charges stemming from the investigation. Perjury, assault, civil rights violations, falsifying reports. A dozen cases, a dozen victims. I wasn't in the courtroom that day, but I watched the verdict on the news in my chambers. He was found guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern woman I respected immensely, sentenced him to an additional 30 years. 56 years in total. He would die in prison. There would be no parole, no second chances. He was no longer a symbol of corrupt power, but a cautionary tale. A relic. That evening, for the first time in months, I dismissed my protective detail. Sarah and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. My jaw was a dull throb, a permanent reminder of that day. But it was a reminder, not a wound. It reminded me that the system, for all its flaws and creaking slowness, can work. It reminded me that one man's hatred can be a catalyst for sweeping change. Frank Miller tried to silence me with a punch. He thought his violence was the ultimate authority, but in the end it was his own undoing. He hit a judge, but he awakened a giant. He swung at one man, but he was crushed by the weight of the very law he had sworn to uphold, and so flagrantly betrayed. The gavel in my hand is just a piece of wood, but on that day and in the days that followed, it proved to be far, far heavier than his fist. And that, I thought, as the last light of day faded, was a victory.